All right, beauties, beautiful people. So we're going to talk about strategies, and what you're going to notice is in the breakthrough codes, we do strategies a little bit differently to how you've been taught in either Prac or Master Prac. 3 years of eliciting strategies, what I've uncovered and what I've found is that generally what happens is people have, in most cases, a 3-step strategy for how they do things. Now, it could be 4 steps, it could be more, of course. There's always a possibility of more. But as a generalization, they operate in 3s. So what we're going to look at here, I'm going to give you a series of questions that will help you to elicit strategies in a different way. Now, you can still use the questions that you've learned up until this point. However, this is another great way of eliciting strategies. You're also going to notice that as we start to do the detailed personal history, also known as the DPH, detailed personal history, that we want to elicit the strategy for the presenting problem. And the reason why we do that is because we want to know how they create what they've created, and we want to elicit all the pieces of that so that we can help to change that. Plus, we also want to know if they can do it now, and we also want to make sure that we get to the deep-rooted structure of the problem and we elicit the strategy of that as well. We also, when we get to the root problem, we also want to elicit the strategy of how they do what they do in 2 other different contexts. So let's say, for an example, you're working in the context of business and you have got to the root cause problem. What you'll do is elicit the strategy of that problem, of that, in that context of how they do what they do. You will also elicit the same thing. Let's say it's that I'm insignificant is the root cause problem. Let's say we're working with I'm insignificant, and you will elicit the strategy of how they do I'm insignificant in a business context. That's one time. You will also then elicit how they do being insignificant in, let's say, relationships and another context. Could be personal development, could be health and fitness, or whatever, family. And so usually how we do a strategy in one context, we do it in all 3. And it's just another beautiful way of being able to elicit how they do what they do and make sure that they're doing it the same way, which generally is how it is. So it just kind of confirms that. It gives us an idea of how they're operating, any differences that may be occurring if there was, but generally they'll do it the same way. So here's what we do. The first thing we're going to do is actually label the behavior. We're going to get them to label the behavior or the problem with one word. So let's say, for an example, I've had clients that I've worked with in relationships, and one of the partners says when they in this state, let's say it's a presenting problem. A presenting problem may be that what they notice is they shut down. And so, while shut down is 2 words, that's okay. It could be 1 word, it could be 2 words. But generally it's a very short answer of a label that we're giving the presenting problem. And in the case of, the root cause of the problem, we already know what that is. I'm insignificant. So when it's a presenting problem, we get them to label it. And the behavior, label the problem that they're experiencing. Now, for some people, it may be anxiety, and that could be the problem or the behavior that they're noticing. But for others, it will be something different, like an actual behavior like shut down, like hiding or shut down or something like that. And so we label that as shut down, and that will be the behavior that is presenting to us. So that is the first step. That is labeling the problem or the behavior. The second step is we actually kind of reverse engineer how we elicit the strategy compared to how we've learnt it before. So we get them to remember a time, a specific time. Again, it's very important that you're working with a specific time. They did that thing, and you'll label what that, let's say it's shut down. When you did the shutdown, and how did you know it was time to shut down? What were you feeling right before you shut down? And so we elicit the emotion, the kinesthetic internal which is generally how people operate right before there's a behavior. It's driven by a state, right? And we know that with the NLP model of communication. External influence comes in, or it could be internal as well. We create internal representation in our minds and in our head, and our internal dialogue and things go on inside of our heads, which immediately couples with state, physiology, and then behavior. So this is how the programming works. And this is why we elicit the strategy in this way. So it's right before. And again, they're not going to know. They're not going to know this consciously. So they have to recall a specific time when they did it. And right before they shut down, what were the feelings? And they might say things like fear, guilt, shame, petrified, anxious, hurt, guilt, whatever. Anything that they say. And the beauty about being able to elicit this is we get lots of the negative emotions that they have, that they're experiencing, that we're going to get to release later. And so it really breaks down a lot of the content, and it just gets us right into the things that they're experiencing. So it's really, really powerful. And that's step number 2, is to get the kinesthetic internal right before the behavior. Then we elicit, but then we go from the right before the behavior right back to the beginning. And so we get the first step. So then we say, can you remember a time? And as you remember that time, that specific time when you did the shutdown, how did you know it was time to feel that? Right? How did you know it was time? And you would rattle off the kinesthetic internal feelings that they mentioned. So how did you know it was time to feel fear and petrified and hurt and guilt and shame and blah, 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 whatever it was that they said. Describe what was going on. And you say that with a command tone, with an authoritarian tone, like describe what was going on. Now, if they get confused and they're like, well, you just say, tell me what happened. Where were you? What was happening around you? What did you see? What did you hear? Or did you have a sensation of something? Because generally what happens is the trigger is that we see something, we hear something, or we have a sensation. And that is usually the first step. Now, could it be something that we see internally in our own mind? Yes, it could be. It could also be that. But what we've got here is it generally is either an auditory external, a visual external, or a kinesthetic sensation, which is we would refer to as an external. And so we work out what was the first thing, the trigger. So now we've got the step before, right before, which is kind of like the third piece of their strategy, right before, which was the emotions, the kinesthetic, and we have the first step. Now we need to get the middle part. And so then we say, just after you, whatever they said, if they said, I saw a picture of something, or they might say, I heard the tone of my partner's voice, or they might say, I had a feeling in my chest, or I had a ball in my chest, and it was a kinesthetic feeling that they had. So you label whatever it was that they said, you use their words, use their language, and you say, just after that thing that happened, and just before you felt whatever it was that they felt, then what was going on inside your head? So usually it's an external thing, then an internal thing, and then a feeling. So this is basically how we're eliciting this strategy to determine in this way. So when we ask them what was going on inside their head, then it could either be they said something to themselves, internal dialogue, our AD. It could be that they heard the sound of someone's voice, or they saw a picture of something internally in their own mind. So let's say they heard the sound of someone's voice and the tone of the voice, and then they pictured something in their mind, and that immediately brought it into the feeling. Now, could they see a picture and then have an AD? Absolutely they could. That would be another step in it. And if it was, then it was. And you'll just add in that next step. But generally, they will probably say something like, I said something to myself, and they said blah, 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 which would be AD, and then they had the feeling. And so this is the system. This is another way that we're going to use, and you'll find it's really useful, really helpful, very effective in being able to quickly decipher and quickly help your client understand what their strategy is for their presenting problem and the root cause problem. We also do the same thing for eliciting when they don't do the problem. And it's the same thing, the exact same steps. So you already know a lot about strategies, you already have learned about them, and so we don't need to dive into this one too much, but you just need to understand that this is the format of how we're going to be eliciting strategies in the breakthrough session. And so this is important for you to grasp and get a handle of. And when we catch up and have our call, we're going to practice this. So if you can find some time to practice this before we have our call this week, then great, please do so. Otherwise, we get to practice together. Amazing. See you on the next session. We get to dive into meta programs.